Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Catherine Weber, and as the interim library director of the Lewiston Public Library, I would like to welcome you all to the Great Falls Forum. The forum is a monthly speaker series featuring leaders in the area of business, public policy, academia, and the arts, and is a partnership of Bates College, the Sun Journal, and the Lewiston Public Library. We thank you for your support and ensuring the program's continued success. Today's program is also streaming live via Zoom and Facebook, and a recording will be available on the library's YouTube page. Please visit lplonline.org for more information. At the conclusion of today's program, there will be an opportunity for audience questions. Those in the room are welcome to raise your hands, and those joining us virtually can either enter their questions using the Q&A feature on Zoom or comment on Facebook, and we'll read those to our speaker. A book sale and signing will also follow the in-person event. Today does conclude the 25th season of the Great Falls Forum, so be on the lookout for next year's schedule when we resume in the fall. And now I have the pleasure of introducing our featured speaker, Margie Patlak. Margie is an award-winning science and nature writer, memoirist, and photographer. Her personal essays and articles have appeared in a number of literary journals, newspapers, and magazines, including the Portland Press Herald, the Ellsworth American, the Philadelphia Inquirer, the Los Angeles Times, the Washington Post, Discover, and Juxtaprose, for which her Rock of Ages won first honorable mention in its 2018 Creative Nonfiction Contest. Margie's photographs have been featured in a number of newspapers, including the Wall Street Journal and the Portland Press Herald, as well as on News Center Maine's television show 207 and B&W Minimalism Magazine's Instagram site. Margie's memoir, More Than Meets the Eye, Exploring Nature and Lost on the Coast of Maine, was given an Outstanding Book Award by the American Society of Journalists and Artists. Her latest photo book, Wild and Wondrous, Nature's Artistry on the Coast of Maine, will be published by Downey's Books in July, and select photos will be on exhibit in Hammond Hall in Winter Harbor, Maine, this summer, in addition to other upcoming exhibits at galleries and libraries throughout the state. Margie has degrees in botany and environmental studies and divides her time between Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, and Korea, Maine. Please join me in welcoming Margie to Lewiston.
I appreciate that great introduction, and thank you to the Great Falls Forum for inviting me to speak. And thank you to all of you who are here today, both in person and virtually, because the whole time I was writing my book, More Than Meets the Eye, I sort of felt like I was having a one-sided conversation with myself. So it's so great that you can complete the other part of the conversation now. And I look forward to hearing what you have to say at the end of my talk. So what I'm going to do today is share with you what the nature of Maine can teach you about the nature of life, renewal, and what remains once the ashes are spread. I found these to be particularly inspiring lessons myself, and they complemented my scientific study of the nature of Maine. And to share them, I'm going to do it in kind of a roundabout way by first telling you how I came to write my book and how More Than Meets the Eye came to be much more than I originally intended it to be. And then I'll read you various excerpts from a few chapters and finish up with a visual tour of the book with some of my photos of some of the scenery and animals that I described in the book. So I came to, started writing More Than Meets the Eye more than, I guess, a dozen years ago when my husband Frank and I bought a place up on in what is affectionately known as Down East Maine. Prior to that time, we did the progression that many people who own a summer home in Maine do, which is to spend decades progressing from tenting to renting to buying. And the reason why we ended up in Maine was really my fault, because I had so many fond childhood memories of spending summers here while on Mount Desert Island while my dad worked at the biology lab there. So even though I was raised in a suburb of Washington, D.C., and I raised a family in the suburb of Philadelphia, I always kind of yearned for that wilder environment I experienced in Maine. And so I was, needless to say, thrilled when we finally returned. I was in Philadelphia, sure, but I wanted the beaches to be rocky, not sandy, and I wanted there to be forests and them to be filled with wild creatures pop out and surprise you. And I wanted to swim in the vastness of the bay rather than be limited to a lap lane in a swimming pool. So when we finally got our place in Maine, I was eager to learn more about my new environment. I've always been kind of a perpetually curious person, so I had lots of questions like, how come the clouds keep piling up in the bay, but it never seems to rain? And where do all the animals in Maine go in the winter, and how do they stay warm? And see, I'm not the only curious one. And they say there are moose in these forests. How come I never see them? So I started, as she mentioned, for 30 years, I've been working as a writer. Want to check the technology a little?
Yeah, sorry. You just want to move that. We'll do this one for now so I can do it.
Is this good? Okay. So I wrote about the basic biology of my new neighbors, the moose and the porcupines and the foxes. And I wrote about the geological forces that thrust up the mountains of Acadia and gave us those wonderful blueberry barrens and bogs, and the astronomical forces that gave us those dramatic tides that we experience up here on the coast of Maine. And to give you an idea of some of the early writing that I did and how humbled I was about everything I had to learn about the nature of Maine, I'm going to read to you from a chapter called Unseen Worlds, which is, do you want me to hold it further? Or?
So sorry, folks. Thank you for your patience.
So this chapter, Unseen Worlds, is about what lenses like microscopes, telescopes, and binoculars can reveal, and about worlds that were previously unseen and how they can connect you to a much vaster realm than what you can see with your naked eye. And the portion that I'm going to read to you is from my chapter, from my section describing a amazing bioluminescent kayak tour that my husband and I did in Castine, Maine. Karen, our tour guide for our night kayak ride in Castine, Maine, is a fit woman with the long black French braid just starting to go gray. While we sign release forms in her cedar shack office, she enchants us with luminous tales. One time I went swimming at night and each step into the water created saucers of light around my feet, she tells Frank and me, another couple and two young women. Just the movement of your paddle in the water will create sparks. Sparks in water? Surely fire cannot exist within water. She explains that many dinoflagellates, those ovoid creatures with tails zipping around under my microscope like circus clowns, have an enzyme that makes a phosphorescent glow. It is the same enzyme that makes fireflies light up. Karen tells us you can see a lot of bioluminescence in the nutrient-rich portions of the bay in Castine we'll be exploring, but it's also common in most oceans and bays. Of course, it changes day to day. Sometimes we see lots of bioluminescence, and some nights we don't see much of anything, Karen says. We walk over to the dock where she outfits each double and single kayak we're about to use with the tiny red light, equips us with life jackets, a whistle, and paddle, and explains how to maneuver the kayak and what to do if it capsizes. By the time Frank and I enter our double kayak, the sun has set and a few stars and the planet Venus start to surface in the sky. We set out of the harbor, dodging pleasure boats anchored in the bay. The bay is so calm, it mirrors the stars emerging in the sky above, enveloping us in a sparkling vastness. Once away from the lights on the dock, it becomes so dark that only the rough outlines of the other double kayaks and the red lights that dot their helms can be seen. But we can hear Karen, who maintains a banter to reassure us. I've had lots of scientists go on this kayak tour, including a marine biologist who told me nobody really knows why there's bioluminescence in the ocean. They all have their theories. Some say the plankton do it to startle their predators or to make visible the bigger critters trying to eat them, who will then be seen and eaten by even bigger fish. but no one really knows. The water is calm, and there is a still coolness in the air that makes me thankful I wore my sweatshirt. Frank and I continue to paddle, but no sparks emerge. Could we be kayaking on one of those nights when the bioluminescence is bland? One time I had a Mars geologist, Karen continues. He's one of those guys who controls the exploring robot on Mars. This reminds me of the oceanographer Robert Ballard, who discovered the sunken Titanic and once commented that half of the United States lies underwater, but we have better maps of Mars than we do of the underwater real estate in our own country. Another oceanographer, Sylvia Earle, pleads that we do more exploring of the ocean, 95% of which we have yet to see, which is surprising given that nearly all of the living space in our planet is in the ocean, according to marine biologist Edith Witter. She also pointed out that it's not just microscopic plankton, but most animals in the sea that emit light. Consequently, the ocean is a magical place filled with breathtaking light shows and bizarre and wondrous creatures, alien life forms that you don't have to travel to another planet to see, she said in a TED Talk. There is no moon, and we're traveling at a steady clip, despite the fact that it is pitch black. I can't see the other kayakers, just their tiny red boat lights. These lights on Karen's kayak keep us on course, as well as her instructions. She guides us to a narrow, shallow stretch of the bay where the phosphorescent plankton is supposed to be especially prevalent. But her general directions do little to calm my nervousness due to night blindness. Keep to the left here or you might hit a rock, she calls out, and Frank adjusts his steering, narrowly missing a boulder, making me shudder. Be careful, the bay is shallow here because of a sandbar, she says a little later, and I imagine us getting stuck. How can you be careful when you can't see anything? But then I see them. Lighting the commotion of our motion, sparks swirl off our paddles like dozens of shooting stars. I put my hand into the water and catch a few of the dancing lights. Oh, wow, I say, I didn't expect them to be so big. Yeah, they clump together, Karen says, maybe because of the silt in the water. And if you see larger circles of light, they're probably copiopods, tiny bioluminescent crustaceans. The fish that eat them collect their light in their gills, and then they start to grow. I stop paddling and put my hand in the water as Frank continues to propel us forward. Each finger sends off a stream of sparkles akin to the glitter given off by Tinkerbell flying or the Good Witch of the North's magic wand. We have been transported to another world. It is as if they wanted to lure the enchanted observer into a realm of fairies. One person wrote about his encounter with phosphorescent creatures in the sea in a letter from 1853. I certainly am enchanted and back paddle to splash harder and spark more of these fireflies of the sea. But Frank starts to complain that I'm slowing us down and we're too far behind the group. So I compromise, submerging a few fingers, mesmerized by the trail of light that follows them. We catch up with Karen, who guides us back to the pier. It's quiet and dark except for a bar called Dennett's. After we pull the kayaks up onto the dock and before returning our equipment, Karen asks us for feedback. So what'd you think, guys? Was it what you expected? It was more than I expected, I say. And one of the young women adds, we saw things out there that most people will never see. I know what you mean, Karen responded. One night, I was the only one kayaking the bay. Not only were there lots of stars and bioluminescence, but the northern lights were dancing across the sky. But everyone was drinking inside Dennett's bar and missed it all. I wanted to shout out to them, come out and see this, guys. You're missing the greatest show on earth. A few days after the kayak tour, I tell my friend Art about our astonishing encounter with bioluminescent plankton. Art is a lobster man who fishes in our bay much of the year. Oh yeah, I see those sparks in the water every time I oar back for my boat if it's late and already dark. I see it all the time. He sees it all the time in our bay. What else am I missing? Okay, so you can probably tell that I had my work cut out for me in learning what there was to know about nature in Maine. And so I continued to write about what I was experiencing. And at a certain point, I realized that something peculiar was happening, and that was that my family kept on poking up into what I was writing about. So, for example, I'd be writing about the 3 generations of the monarch butterfly that it takes to go from their winter grounds in Mexico to their summer grounds in Maine. And that would morph into me writing about the migration of my own family and what was passed on from generation to generation. Or I'd be writing about the dramatic 12-foot tides that we have in our area and how they shape our daily activities. And then the next thing I know, I'm writing about the fleeting nature of time and the especially ephemeral nature of raising my son, Jake. So I thought it was kind of peculiar that my family kept popping up. I mean, it wasn't just, my son, but my brother, my parents, even my great grandparents and grandparents kept on showing up. And I didn't really understand why until I was back in Philadelphia, where we spent our winters and springs. And there I was part of a writers group. And the leader of that writers group suggested that I pull together these writings I've been doing about Maine into a book. And to get a better sense of what that book was about, she said, why don't you just write an introduction to it? So I did that, and that ended up becoming the prologue of my book, and it totally surprised me. And I think you'll see why when I read it to you now. The seals swim out to meet my mother. We are gathered on the weathered gray dock of a rented Maine house, a simple cedar log cabin surrounded by forest, much like many of the cottages we stayed in during summer while my father worked at a nearby biology research lab. Sunlight glints on the water and a cool breeze wafts the distinctive aroma of the rocky coast, a pungent combination of the earthy spiciness of fir, pine, and spruce trees and the fishy smells of seaweed, mussels, and cobbles soaked in brine. Although my mother grew up in an apartment building in Chicago and lived most of her life tied to the asphalt of various cities, she always loved the summers we spent on the sparsely populated Mount Desert Island in Maine. She took us blueberry picking on the boulder-strewn hill near the lab, frog hunting at the local pond, and clam digging on the bay at low tide. My mom loved looking out at all the beauty by the water, the bay framed by wind-sculpted silhouettes of the trees like those in Japanese paintings, the gossamer fog at sunrise, the rosy hues of the sky reflected in the water as the sun sank. So we thought it only appropriate to scatter my mother's remains in the Gulf of Maine. Gulls scatter in all directions, crying in protest at our arrival at the dock, and a kingfisher rattles away, flying off his pine perch. On a distant rock outcropping, a cormorant stretches out its large black wings like a cloak. Reflected clouds drift through water dotted with the bobbing buoys of lobster traps. Overshadowed by the looming mountains behind us, our family huddles on the creaking wooden platform, dwarfed by the backdrop of the expansive blue bay. Both my balding brother and elderly father rest heavily on their canes while I take a folded piece of paper out of my jeans pocket and quote from a condolence letter Albert Einstein wrote to the widow of a friend. In quitting this strange world, he is once again preceding me by just a little, I say, wondering if Einstein's notion that time is an endless loop with no distinctions between past, present, and future resonates with my gray-bearded brother and father, both of whom have degrees in physics. A pair of loons responds with sonorous laments. I try to make eye contact with my brother's 2 grown sons, but they are gazing at the splintered gray boards under their feet. My father is dry-eyed, but my 12-year-old daughter starts to sniffle. My oldest child, Jake, and my brother's oldest son, Johan, both gangly, slip into kayaks tethered to the dock. After we untie their ropes and give each son a paddle, my brother's wife hands Johan the small cardboard box of ashes and he plies the glassy water, Jake paddling his kayak in parallel. My husband, Frank, puts his arm around my slumped shoulders and we watch as my mother's grandsons, boys that had become men while she encountered her final years, put away their paddles and together shake out flecks of her bone and ash. How could my mother, whose caramel eyes reflected delight in my every achievement and whose angry outbursts made me cower in my bedroom, be reduced to that small package of dust? While the gray powder falls into the water, it sinks in that I am truly a motherless child. But I wrestle with that big biblical notion of ashes to ashes. Surely something remains. While the last bits of my mother slip into the sea, a few curious seals swim out over to see what is falling into their waters. A beautiful swirling dance ensues as their swimming heads engrave the calm water with V's that eventually merge with the kayak's wake. It is entrancing, and though I do not feel my mother is embodied in her ashes, there is something comforting about her being welcomed by these tidal dwellers and returned to Maine and the primordial sea. 2 years later, it is the ash remains of my brother's 55-year-old body that are spread on a mountain in Vermont. He was diagnosed with Lou Gehrig's disease, also called ALS, the week my mom died. Just a few months after we gathered in Maine, my brother became confined to a wheelchair and quickly lost the ability to move most of his body. From the moment my mother was diagnosed with metastatic cancer to the time my father died 10 years later, death lapped at the edges of my family like an incoming tide that quickly submerges the small islands it encounters. Propelled in part by my brother's death and a deepening awareness that life can be short, Frank and I decided to make the most of our own remaining lives. We took the plunge and used proceeds from the sale of Frank's business in Philadelphia to buy a 5-acre slice of a northern Maine forest and bay with the cedar, mahogany, and glass Frank Lloyd Wrightish house my mother would have loved. We started spending summers there, and then after our daughter went off to college, falls as well. Frank always had that business instinct of buying low and selling high and saw it as having such a house on the coast of Maine as a good investment. I saw it as an emotional lifesaver. So I think you can see why I was so surprised, because here I thought I was writing a book about the nature of Maine, but I was also writing about what the nature of Maine was teaching me about the nature of life. And by raising such questions like what remains once the ashes are spread, I was venturing into spiritual territory that no amount of scientific research could fully answer, right? So from that point on, I started viewing what I was experiencing writing about with both a spiritual and a scientific lens. And it was also at that point that I committed myself to putting together what I had written into a book, because I thought that what I was learning might help others who are experiencing a loss of some sort or another. So now I'm going to read to you a section from my chapter called Tugged by the Tides. I'm going to read to you from my chapter called Matriarchs and Monarchs, which is a lesson that was taught to me by a monarch butterfly. It is a summer of butterflies. Colorful fluttering is everywhere. A gathering of blossoms in my garden provides an enticing oasis of nectar in the midst of a forest clearing. Flowers of all shapes and colors line a pink granite path leading from the house down to the rocky Maine shore. But all I see are butterflies. The startling indigo eye spot on the taupe wing of the buckeye butterfly stares at me while it drinks. Nearby, a series of orange fritillaries speckled with brown line up on a flowering stalk like a regiment, each on its own pink perch of flora. If I get too close, they twirl away, chasing each other up into the sky. But the most familiar is the most enchanting, the monarch. Monarchs sail in to sip from yellow coreopsis flowers, their wings like stained glass windows in a cathedral, each orange segment outlined in black. Are they part of the herd of monarchs that migrate all the way from Maine down to Mexico? Or are they allowed only one brief hop in a series of hops that takes their species in the reverse direction from Mexico to Canada? It takes 3 to 4 generations of monarchs to make this journey of more than 2,000 miles. Each butterfly lives about 2 months and travels only part of the way before laying eggs on butterfly weed and other milkweed species. These eggs enable the next generation of butterflies to carry on the trek north. The final generation that makes the return flight to Mexico can live as long as 9 months. As Carl Safina noted in his book, The View from Lazy Point, this raises questions much bigger than the butterflies themselves. How do they know what generation they're from and what they are supposed to do? Each hop-skipping generation of monarchs has the same genetic blueprint, so different genes can't solely explain why the northbound butterflies live only a few months while the southbound live several seasons. Scientists suspect that certain light lengths and temperatures might alter the activity of specific migratory genes in the monarch to cause the differences in generations. But still a mystery is how the monarch butterfly, over a span of so many generations, knows to return each year to the same forested slope in Mexico to winter. It's the equivalent of long dead great-grandparents dictating where their great-grandchildren spend the winters. My long dead great-grandparents were Jews in Tsarist Russia who were restricted to villages known as shtetls. They left Russia to avoid having their 12-year-old sons conscripted into the army, their daughters raped during the carnage of pogroms. As a child, I overheard disturbing shards of stories about the old country. Such sorrows we had, so many pogroms. I was a baby during one, and my mother hid me in a dresser drawer, my grandmother told my mother as they ate slices of her still warm apple cake, and I did homework nearby. Another time, my father was coming home from work when someone just started shooting at him. Thanks God he was able to hide behind some trash cans. Like the monarchs who hopscotched their way across the globe to find better opportunities, at the turn of the 20th century, my great-grandmother and her family packed a few belongings and embarked on a voyage to England and then to America, where 50 years later I would meet her, a tiny bent-over old woman in Chicago who always wore a babushka from which only her nose protruded, the rest of her face sunken into wrinkles. We called her the old bubby, and my parents would prod me to come close to her so she could hug me. But I shrank back from this shriveled up woman who resembled the witches in my picture books. The monarchs I'm seeing on the move are probably northbound and have laid eggs in my garden. Shortly after they arrive, I spot the telltale bright yellow, black, and white stripes of monarch caterpillars contrasting like crosswalk markings with the green leaves of the butterfly weed plants they eat. Monarch caterpillars take only 4 days to hatch from eggs. And when I first discovered them, but after a few days of continually devouring leaves, they grow to be as long as a thumb. Eager to see what happens next, I pluck one of the fatter and longer caterpillars from the butterfly weed and put it in a glass jar, replacing its metal lid with a paper towel perforated by a fork. I add some butterfly weed leaves, which disappear each day into the caterpillar's mouth. My daughter asked me if we might be harming the caterpillar by holding it captive. I reply, she asked, will we disrupt its natural passage into a butterfly? I explained to Eva that as long as we keep the caterpillar supplied with the leaves it has evolved to feed on, we won't stop it from unfolding into a butterfly any more than we can stop a woman in labor from giving birth. A few nights later, the caterpillar stops eating, and before going to sleep, I notice the caterpillar has climbed to the top of the jar where it hangs motionless from a paper towel lid. The lower end of its body curves so it resembles the letter J. Checking the following morning, I discover no caterpillar, but a chrysalis, a surprisingly smooth chartreuse pendant dangling at the top of the jar from what was recently the last pair of its black legs, with a striking bracelet of gold edged with black encircling its conical top. Promise me you'll take the candlesticks, my mother said the day she stopped eating. Her pale face, framed by short-cropped white hair, was gaunt from the cancer consuming her, revealing high cheekbones that had been hidden for years and sinking her large, contemplative eyes into a skeletal frame. I told the old bubby I would pass them on to you. My great-grandmother had brought these silver candlesticks from Russia, and I always admired their ornate swirls of etched leaves, emblems of the earth that grounded these objects of piety into nature. One used to beckon the Sabbath into the old bubby's home. The light from these candlesticks eventually had to welcome major Jewish holidays into our own household. I assured my mother I would take the candlesticks and even promised her I would have Eva polish them like I once did before every Passover. A few days later, my brother closed our mother's eyes for the last time and wept, his shoulders heaving. The workers from the funeral home came and carelessly carted her away, cocooned in a black body bag, leaving behind a profound emptiness. I brought the candlesticks home that night and wrote my mother's eulogy, marking her passage by noting each important step she took. Attending college in the 40s and marrying my father, having 2 children in the 50s, teaching at Head Start in the 60s, going to grad school during the 70s, and starting a psychotherapy practice during the 80s. It was a full life, but she wasn't ready for it to be over. Look at all those books I'll never get to read, she said shortly before she died, pointing to a stack next to her bed. Maybe you'll want to read them after I'm gone. Once my mother died, the limits of her life, of all our lives, became apparent. Each of us carries out a mere step or two that moves our family forward in time. My great-grandparents took a big leap coming to this country and then worked long hours as a tailor and homemaker so that their son could become a doctor and their daughter, my grandmother, could live a much more secure and comfortable life than the one she left behind in Russia. It's not just candlesticks that get passed from one generation to another. My mother handed off her gift of life with all its unfinished business and imperfections to me, and I will in turn hand off the same gift to Eva. There's just so much each of us can accomplish in one lifetime, but the seemingly impossible becomes possible when all the generations are strung together, each of us playing a humble role in a magnificently evolving lifeline. The monarch knows this instinctively. So I have to mention that when I read this in a Zoom book talk for the Camden Public Library, it was at the end of the day, and I was seated at my dining room table. And right as I talked about these candlesticks, a beam of light came in and highlighted the candlesticks that were behind me. and everybody was like busy typing in the Zoom, look, look, look. It was kind of a magical moment. But this chapter goes on to answer in more detail what remains once the ashes are spread. And now I'm going to read to you a last segment from my book that answers the question, what remains when a son grows up and leaves home? And this is coming from my Tug by the Tides chapter. The powerful pull of the moon is especially apparent on the Maine shore, where it creates 13-foot tides that routinely fill and empty bays and determine daily rhythms of activity. On my cobbled U-shaped bay, the underwater real estate opens up twice each day, revealing denizens with just a few hours to make the most of their temporary stay on land. Some scurry about like tourists released from a cruise ship. One adventuresome crab, venturing sideways as far as the ledge that abuts the bay, was surprised to encounter a landlubber in an Adirondack chair. Snails hunker down in their shells or roam in tidal pools where they are shielded from the dry air until the sea washes them again. Snails and crabs aren't the only ones exposed by the tug of the moon at low tide. It also creates ephemeral pathways to teardrop islands in the distant sea. At a local beach at high tide, a wide swath of ocean separates you from one of these tiny islands, which beckons with its outcroppings topped with the jagged jades of conifers. But if you're fortunate to be there close to low tide, within minutes, a triangle of pebbles, periwinkles, and cobbles suddenly appears next to the linear shore and points to the distant island. Like Moses' parting of the Red Sea, this era of emerging land quickly spreads wider and longer until it forms a crunchy barnacle-like passageway to the previous inaccessible Bar Island. At this point, and no later, you must walk this bridge of stones to explore the island because after a mere hour, the sea will seep in and surround it again. If deaf to the ticking of the tidal clock, I miss the limited time there is to climb Bar Island's basalt boulders, which resemble beached whales, and admire its driftwood sculptures and trees shaped by the wind. After biking the sinuous route to the entrance of the forested beach path, gingerly walking weathered boards over the boggy ground leading to the cobbled shore, and finally broaching the sweet-scented wild rose bushes edging the beach, I often discover the ephemeral land bridge to Bar Island has vanished underwater. The tide has turned. It's not just on the Maine shore that time passes quickly. Time especially speeds up when you have small children. Don't blink or you might miss him growing up, people would tell me when they saw me chasing after Jake when he was small. But I was too busy addressing the ever-present and pressing demands of a small person. A diaper change, an earache requiring a doctor's visit, a trek to the park so that Jake, like a dog, could run off his boundless energy and satisfy his need to explore. I didn't realize that my amazement in seeing my son take his first wobbly steps away from me would evolve so soon into wistfulness when he later walked much farther into his own life on other coasts and continents. I tried to slow down and savor the world as seen through Jake's eyes, his magical thinking that a new pair of sneakers would make him run faster, his imagination turning shadows into roaming monsters and sticks into swords that cut them down. His delight in the ordinary, a bobbing balloon or a chirping cricket would bring him so much pleasure. Especially enjoyable was Jake's insatiable curiosity that led him to turn over dead logs in the forest to see creatures crawling beneath, or that prompted him to scamper from one tidal pool to another looking for suckered starfish. But more often I was muddled by the mundane, writing articles, making meals, tackling mounds of laundry, walking the aisles of the grocery store, filling out endless school forms, or tending Jake's younger sister. There was not enough time to enter his wondrous world, except for a few notable milestones, such as riding a bike, driving a car, or graduating high school. Jake grew up without me fully noticing. One minute he was pleading, "Carry me," as we walked up the large hill between library and home, and the next minute he was navigating the Tokyo subway system on his own. The tide had turned. The quintessential tale about tides is that of the Viking king Canute, who was raised on the shores of the North Sea that surrounded Denmark. Canute went on to not only rule his native country, but also Norway and England. Legend has it that Canute's courtiers came to admire his power so much that they claimed he also had the power to command the tides of the sea to retreat. But Canute knew to be humble before the sea that cradled him, to show that even a king's power is worthless compared to the forces of nature. Canute had his throne carried to the seashore and sat on it as the tide came in, commanding the waves to come no further. Of course, the waves splashed closer and closer, sending up sea spray. When water swirled around the legs of his throne, Canute supposedly said, "See, there is no king worthy of the name of God whom heaven, earth, and sea obey." Canute knew that tides are a rhythmic force of nature that cannot bend to the whims of a man, even if that man wears a crown on his head. A king cannot stop the swelling of a tide, just like a mother cannot stop her son from growing up. The constantly changing tides were also an eye-opener to me when I started spending summers in Maine. To go swimming or kayaking, I have to stop working at high tide. To collect sea glass or explore the islands, I need to close my computer at low tide. Like King Canute, I am ruled by the immense, uncontrollable power of the tides, and I try to match my rhythms of work and play with the ebb and flow of water that follows the moon. This way of marking time makes me more aware of time passing and the need to make the most of every moment. The phone rings and I hear the deep voice of my son, who lives far away on another coast. Many moons have ushered him into adulthood, but Jake hasn't lost his childlike curiosity about the world around him and tries to make the most of his temporary stays wherever his job takes him, exploring each location like a zealous crab scurrying about the Maine shore at low tide. When he moved to California and close to deserts emptied of city lights, Jake bought a telescope and became especially attuned to the moon's rhythms, purposely timing moon and stargazing trips to the lunar cycle. Now deep into his 20s, Jake follows not only our moon, but the moons of Jupiter and other nearby planets with his telescope. Although I wish he were here exploring the shore with me, I enjoy seeing the other worlds through Jake's eyes. A friend related to me with some distress that adult children were like wandering pieces of yourself over which you have no control. As I told Jake when he was in high school, worrying about his welfare was part of my job description as a mom, and explained why I couldn't sleep well at night until after I heard his key turn in the lock of the front door. But I've learned to let go over the years we've spent apart, to appreciate Jake's adventuresome nature, which led him to visit more than a dozen countries and return with tales of spinning Sufis, Egyptian pyramids, Somali pirates, and almost freezing to death in a hut in the mountains of Croatia.
And I've come to accept the temporary nature of the years he spent living with us, recognizing his childhood was borrowed time. For as the Lebanese poet Khalil Gibran pointed out in The Prophet, your children are not your children. They are the sons and daughters of life's longing for itself. They come through you, but not from you. And though they are with you, yet they belong not to you. He stressed that the souls of children dwell in the house of tomorrow, which you cannot visit, not even in your dreams. So parents must view themselves merely as the bows from which your children, as living arrows, are sent forth. Like the perpetual tides, my children will live on without me, will sow our lineage far into the future, which somehow is comforting. A rabbi told me that mothers are closest to their children when they are newborns and recently separated from these beings that once were a part of them. Not used to this separation, mothers still see their babies as extensions of themselves, and perhaps this explains in part their intense protectiveness. But there is also something to be gained in the ebbing of the parental pull that occurs as your child grows. The essence of a son or a daughter can be seen only at a distance. When viewed too close, it becomes obscured like a pointillist painting. The moon was awesome the other night, my son tells me on the phone, describing all the craters he could see with the aid of the powerful lenses of his telescope. I know, I said, looking out my windows at a bay emptied of water pulled by the full moon. I know. So the final chapter of my book is called Fall Migration, and it's in this chapter that I discuss the amazing, massive migration south of birds and dragonflies and other animals as the cold weather ensues in Maine. And it's also in this chapter that I contemplate my own migration south to Philadelphia and sort of sum up all the lessons learned from my sojourns in Maine and recap my spiritual philosophy that is so rooted in nature and helped me heal from my losses. But rather than read from that, I'm hoping that you'll get the book and read it yourself. So the book is available at many libraries and bookstores in Maine, and I'll be selling it here today afterwards. And then you can also find it online at bookshop.org, which supports local bookstores, and Amazon.com and BarnesandNoble.com that doesn't. And now we'll switch gears and go to my visual tour of the book, and I'll share you some of my photographs of what I just described to you, and I'll get off the stage. Okay, and dim the light so you can see that better. There we go. So Maine is 90% forested, and I think this illustrates that pretty well. This was taken, I think, from Acadia National Park in the fall. And you can go to the next one. And I think what also makes Maine unique is how close the forest and the coast and the mountains all are, as you can see from this photo that was taken of my husband on top of Penobscot in Acadia National Park. Okay, and the next one. This is Raven's Nest. It's in the Schoodic Peninsula. This is the Schoodic Acadia Peninsula. This is the part of the Acadia National Park that is on there. And it just shows you how there's so many intersections in the landscapes in Maine, right on the coast. Okay. And this is a porcupine walking down our development nonchalantly because it has no predators. Its main predator is a fisher that was overhunted years ago. So unfortunately, fortunately for it, but unfortunately for us, the porcupines are overpopulated on the Schoodic Peninsula, and us who like to garden are continually battling with them because they do a lot of destruction in gardens. And so I have one chapter called Out of Eden, which is about my battle with the porcupine, but more deeply is about my struggle to figure out where in nature I belong. Okay, next. This is the fox that I describe in my chapter, Outfoxed. You often see them alongside the road. Okay, next. Just to show you the dramatic tides we have, this is our bay when it's close to high tide. You see those two rocks in the foreground, and just pay attention what happens as we progress through the slide. So in the next one, see how there's grasses coming in, and then the next one. This is pretty much at low tide. And then in the next slide, this is at one of these extreme low tides that we experience, I don't know, 4 to 6 times a year. And in the very far distance, you can see our house right in the center of the picture in between the trees. And I had to walk across all that slippery seaweed to take a picture of what's in the other direction. So you can go to the next slide, which was this, which of course I had to capture because it was just awesome. Okay, next. So I describe in my book that at high tide, it's a great time to go kayaking in the nearby marshes and see the birds and other wildlife there. This is taken from my kayak, okay. And this is the beach in Korea that I was describing to you at high tide in the chapter I just read from. And then next, this is that triangle of pebbles that just magically appears as the, gets to be low tide. And then on the next slide, you can see it creates this temporary land bridge to Bar Island, which go to the next one. You can see more better here. And then on the next slide, you can see what it looks like if you have a chance to explore it. It's like these big boulders and pretty denuded of vegetation, as you can see from the next slide. As the next slide shows you, it's just like, in some places, you just feel like you're on another planet. It's pretty awesome. Especially it's magical because you just have so little time to explore it. It's like being in a fairy tale, like, you're about to turn into a pumpkin or something if you don't get out of there soon enough. Okay, next. All right, this is the Yamata caterpillar that I just read to you about in my garden on butterfly weed. And the next slide will show its progression into a beautiful chrysalis. And then on the next one, this is what it looks like right as it's about to emerge. And you can see the wing of the butterfly. And here it is drying its wings off, so posing for me. Okay. And then this is a fritillary, which is another common butterfly in Maine, in my garden. These are spotted salamander eggs that form in the temporary ponds and roadside ditches. And they're green because they have this amazing symbiotic relationship with algae that eat up their waste, but give them the oxygen they need to develop. So they're one of the few photosynthesizing animals, at least at this stage of their game. Okay. And I described that in my book. And then this is a autumn meadowlark dragonfly resting in the fall and trying to warm up its wings as it progresses. This one is not known to migrate, but many others are south for the winter. Okay, next. You can't have a chapter, a book in Maine without a chapter on fog. So these next few slides just illustrate the fog and how it completely takes away the horizon sometimes. And this is Jordan Pond in the fog. And this was taken in the winter. I have a chapter in my book on winter, and these are the remains of the little tunnels that the mice build in the snow in the winter because the snow insulates them and keeps them warm. So this sort of answers my question, what happens to the animals in the winter? And this is a raccoon footprint in the ice and snow. And this, I have a chapter called Rock of Ages, which is all about the geology of our area, and in particular Little Moose Island. And these are those basalt intrusions in the granite there that are so striking, these black lines. Next. And here it is in the winter. Next. And because clouds are born on the coast, and because we have these big open spaces, I find it's a wonderful place to explore the different kinds of clouds. So these are, see those two clouds that look like flying spaceships? They're called lenticular clouds, and they form over mountains. You can go to the next one. This one I took it on my bay at sunrise. I think I got up at like 5:30 in the morning to take it. And when I posted that on Instagram, my friend Becky wrote, "Oh, I can see why you got up so early, because with such beauty, how could you sleep in?" And then my final slide is just to show you my next book, which will be out in July, but you can pre-order it now online. And it's just a photo book of many of these photos I've shown you, plus, I think altogether there's about 150 photos. And so you might want to look out for that. And now I welcome any questions or comments that people have. Don't be shy. Yes.
I was listening. Anyway, well, I was listening to Maine Public Radio this morning. They were saying about 3,000 miles of Maine coastline, about 50 miles is working waterfront. Okay.
Mhm.
And a lot of it. And then I was listening to Maine Callahan about homelessness. And somebody from up north called in and said, there's a problem because some people with money are coming in and buying up these houses.
Yeah.
There's been this huge increase. And I wonder, I mean, this is very beautiful. How does one afford to do it?
Well, you know, there are I appreciate the concern that you're expressing, and there are organizations in Maine that have been set up to preserve the coastline, and they've, but it's true that this is a growing issue, and you know, we had a clamor stop one time and asked if he could access the coast from our bay, you know, to do clamming, and we said fine, and he did that. But there are, in our development, there are access points for the community, so you know, paths that they can take to go through the water, and he wanted to be able to access it more easily, so that's why he asked us. There, you know, it's for the lobstering, I think a lot of, like Korea is a fishing town, so it has all these docks and everything that are preserved that fishermen go out from. So I don't think access is too much of a problem for them at this point, as long as they have those docks. Does that answer your question? Sort of.
I think it's a big problem. It's long been a problem.
Yeah. Yeah.
Somebody with money has bought up a lot of property, homes, apartments, and even years.
Yeah.
You know, it's you know, yes, somebody can come in and plan, but dependent upon, you know, the good graces of
Yeah.
people who live there.
Yeah.
And I think we see it that.
Mhm. Yeah.
Not only Maine, but all of
Yeah. Yeah. It is going to be a problem.
this is a fine waterfront as well.
Yeah. Yes.
On one of your last slides, it showed a picture of a sky, I think, like orange and black. Was that a sunrise or a sunset?
That was a sunrise. Yeah. That's the one I
Wow.
took at 5:30 in the morning.
I
Yeah.
never saw nothing like that.
Yeah. Yeah. That's why I make sure to get up with the sun, because I don't want to miss anything like that.
And where was that taken from?
That was taken from our bay in our backyard, basically.
Oh, wow. You're
Yeah.
lucky.
Yeah.
I'm going to move next to you.
Yeah. We're extremely lucky. And another question over here.
What do you use for a camera?
I use my iPhone. You know, I started off doing photography more than 30 years ago, you know, and I had one of these big bulky SLRs with all the different lenses, and I even had my own black and white darkroom and stuff. But as the years progressed and the technology got better, I got smaller and smaller cameras, and finally I realized I could do everything I needed to do with the iPhone. And you need something small like that when you're kayaking or biking or, you know, hiking up a mountain. So, and it's amazing. It really takes great photos. For my exhibit, I'm blowing up macro shots to, like, the images are being blown up to about 16 by 16, and they're fine. So I never went back to my big bulky camera. Yes.
Did you raise your children on the books of Rachel Carson?
Did I what?
I'm reminded of a woman talking about the nature and the shore.
Uh-huh.
Rachel Carson, the sea beside us, or the main. No, she herself a generation or two ago wrote a lot about
Of course, yes. I read
Coast.
many of her books and I quote many of her
So I just
books.
wondered if you raised your children on those.
Well, more or less, yeah. I definitely read them passages, and I definitely included some passages in my book. And there's a wonderful book called A Sense of Wonder that was a photographic version of an essay that she did on the sense of wonder that you need to impart to a small child about nature. And that's always been on my coffee table. Any other questions or comments? No?
Do you have a favorite thing that you like to photograph?
No, most people specialize in either doing landscapes or macro photography or whatever. I just do it all. My favorite thing to photograph is nature, but anything's game. And when my children were growing up, all I did was take pictures of them. That was my favorite thing. But now that they're grown, I'm back to taking pictures of nature. All right. Well, thank you very much again.
Thank you, Margie.